Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Security Shorts with Scott. Very excited about the conversation we're going to have today with a old friend who's been around a long time in the industry. He looks young, but he's got some amazing stories. Welcome to Security Shorts with Scott, Mr. Weiss Issa.
Thanks, Scott. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for joining, and good to have you. Weiss is currently the CEO of Ubiq Security. And Weiss, one of the things we like to do is just, before we jump straight into the heavy topic around security, is have a little bit of a story about yourself. So, how did you get into the industry, or do you have anything interesting to share about, being and working in information security?
Sure. Interestingly, I didn't start my career off in InfoSec. I actually started off in finance. Early on, that's what I thought I was passionate about. And it wasn't until I got exposed to information security that I really got drawn into it. And what really pulled me was the mission centricity of most security organizations. And that's something that sort of stayed with me throughout my entire career. And I recall sort of my last day at my finance gig, 17th floor, beautiful city view, and then transitioning to the new company in my first day, literally an office room, a giant sock with no windows, and the building was on stilts because it was a flood zone. And about 9 months later, the building actually got flooded. So interesting way to start.
I know that building. I worked in that building at one point in time, and I do remember. So, lesson learned there: people don't build your security operations center in a flood zone. Seems like that would be common sense. But hey, we were young and we were a fledgling startup at the time. So, Weiss, the topic that we have today is encryption. And I think most people are familiar with the concept of taking data and trying to lock it up in a certain way to make it secure. But when it comes to encryption, what's sort of the modern status? What's happening around encryption, and why should people care?
It's a fantastic question, Scott. I'll split into two buckets. Bucket one is just general cryptography. Things like algorithms and advancements in that space have been pretty significant, really, in the last 2 or 3 years. And there's been some really solid research around things like quantum proof encryption for easily the last 10 years. The second bucket is sort of applying that encryption or that encryption methodology to data at rest and in transit. And I think the data in transit aspect, which is are we securing and encrypting data as it's flowing inside or outside of a network, is mostly a solved problem. The area where I think there can be more focus and I think will really move the needle is how do we secure data at rest? And I think that's an area of opportunity for the industry to get better.
Yeah, it's a great point because everyone's sort of familiar with the S and the HTTPS, or they see the little lock sign, and that's the concept of taking data and securing it in transit. But securing data at rest has been a challenge for a long time, especially when you're trying to combine it with the transit. So is that sort of why encryption isn't as ubiquitous as it needs to be right now? Is that the challenge that people are facing and trying to solve?
I think it depends on the organization size, and also the type of data they're handling. If you're a fledgling company that's got literally a database and that's where all the sensitive data in your company is stored, then I think your ability to tackle that problem is going to be substantially, less bumpy. The road is going to be less bumpy than for a company that's 200,000 employees that's got data in file servers and file shares, and some of it's sitting in the cloud. It could be multi-cloud, and then they've got data warehouse environments, database environments, and that's really where the complexity comes in for the large organizations. You've got data in a lot of different places, and unfortunately, the approaches to secure that data or encrypt that data are going to be inconsistent and hard to manage. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, the inconsistency and the lack of having sort of a central control plane or a central methodology to encrypt data consistently.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept because we're all very familiar with management consoles of various sundry applications or tool sets or hardware. So we're used to sort of this control plane in the industry. But encryption is not really that way. It's just like an algorithm that some devs throw into, come with whatever, piece of software that you're coding in. And so if you're a large organization, getting consistency seems like that'd be a massive challenge because you could be coding in 20 different languages with 20 different devs doing it 20 different ways across a thousand different apps. Is that really sort of what you're talking about there?
It can be, Scott. And you actually touched on a really
Yeah.
important point, which is if we take a step back and think about at-rest encryption, the traditional solutions that have been popular for nearly 20 years have been things like full disk encryption or transparent data encryption, which is the common methodology used for databases. And those are generally settings that you apply at the server or database layer. So it's sort of an infrastructure function or a database administration function. What we've seen in the last probably 5 to 7 years is the emergence and the adoption of encryption algorithms that are specific to programming languages. And that starts to take us into the realm of what's sort of an emerging methodology for data encryption, which is application layer encryption, which is the idea that you embed the encryption natively into the application because that's what's creating, accessing, modifying, or sharing the data in many cases. And you're right. We've seen and we've worked with large organizations where they literally have, 5 to 7 major programming languages in use. They could have over 10 or 15 different storage types. And when you get to that scale, and this becomes a problem area where you're willing to invest based on strategic risk mitigation or your threat model as a company, it can get really complicated. And we've seen some very large organizations literally invest in building a custom solution and hiring a team of cryptographers and data encryption specialists to do that, which can cost you up to $10-15 million a year just to operate.
Which makes total sense, right? Because if the applications are generating the data and they're the presentation layer of the data, then the ability to secure it from endpoint to endpoint with it being at rest as just a stopping area makes sense. And I guess that sort of goes to a question I've got around, size of companies that should care about this. So we're a relatively small company. We're not, a big, huge telco, but we use Ubiq because we view a lot of data as important to secure. But a lot of the data we secure is not traditionally viewed as important data. It could be just, customer data. So how do you view the approach that small companies should take relative to a large company? Because large companies should be solving this. Maybe Ubiq helps make that easier. And then small companies, should they care right now?
Short answer is they should care. If they're handling sensitive data, they should, do their best to safeguard that data. And larger companies generally are under some sort of regulatory regime, whether it's PCI or HIPAA. So their hands are forced a bit, and they have to put controls in place. When you're an earlier stage company, you sort of have the luxury of not having that pressure. But at the end of the day, the earlier you implement a solution to safeguard important sensitive data, I think the better you off in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that's why we did it. It's really easy to just sort of throw something in and build up that tech debt. But if you can get a programmatic approach to a technical problem earlier, it really sort of saves you some cycles down the line and in the future. And I think that's something that people should think about. Um, Weiss, I love what Ubiq does. I love the fact that you all bring a level of consistency and scale, and you really help solve this problem sort of end to end. Any final thoughts that you want to leave with, as we sort of wrap up today?
Yeah, I think before you start your next gig, make sure the building's not in a flood zone.
I will, I will, I will definitely do that and take that under advisement. So with that, Weiss, thank you for joining us on Security Shorts with Scott. To the audience, as always, thanks for watching. Hopefully this was helpful, interesting. There's some actually really cool stuff happening in encryption, and I think you're going to see a complete transformation of the industry. I think Ubiqu's going to be at the forefront of that, and look forward to seeing what happens there. If there's any other questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me or feel free to reach out to Weiss, our guest. So with that, thank you all for tuning in.